So, well, our new study that I decided to go with is the book of Judges. And part of the reason I picked it was when we did a vote last time on what to study, and we picked Galatians, the second topic, the one that got almost as many votes as Galatians, was Judges, surprisingly enough. Also, it's one that I, for whatever reason, as messy as the book is, I really, really enjoy it. I've written a master's thesis dealing with part of the book of Judges. A lot of my dissertation is dealing with parts of the book of Judges. I spent a lot of time in the book of Judges, a lot of time. And it's one that I find fascinating, and it's one that I think we don't always spend enough time with, and I'll explain why. So let's start. When we talk about the book of Judges, here's how I think most of us end up engaging it. I'll give you some examples. Children's book about Gideon. This is my favorite. The learning Bible stories from Archway books. I remember Archway books growing up. And boy, I look at them very differently now. Samson, strong and faithful. Oh, I would strongly object to one of those adjectives. But that's how we position it. Or, Deborah saves the day. Or another one on Deborah, the brave lady who listened to God. Do you see any common theme in how we approach these stories? Okay, yeah, they're very simplistic, and again, they're kids' stories. They tend to be simplistic. What else?
Heroes.
Oh, they're hero stories. Yeah, and in fact, in some cases, they're superhero stories. All right. What else? Anything else you notice?
They give us a hero. They give us something to be like, to emulate.
Okay. Yeah, they give us something to emulate. I also like how, like the one in the middle, Deborah is all smiling and happy, and I assume that's Barak with the sword in the middle, who's all smiling and happy, and the woman with the jug that must have milk on it, I assume is Jael, smiling and happy. I'm not sure that's a look I would put on Jael's face. And she's interesting. She's holding a jug and not a hammer and a tent peg. Yeah. So when we engage these stories, we tend to engage them as kids, and they are a popular part of our childhood. Our childhood Sunday school stories. We simplify them out of necessity, and we end up telling them as superhero stories or hero stories. And the problem is that I don't think we ever really go back and revisit these stories as adults to kind of take another look at them. And in fact, I'm probably guilty of this myself. I've taught the book of Judges several times through my time as a adult Bible school teacher, and there are times probably fairly early on when I reverted back to the Sunday school interpretations that I learned as a kid, instead of engaging these stories on an adult level. And they are very adult stories. Very adult stories. And they are dark. At times they are funny. But they are stories with important themes. Okay, and I put that in parentheses. Themes, plural. Not just one theme. And I think there's multiple ways we can read and look at the book of Judges and I'll give you one of them today, that I think reveals some important truths for us that are still important for us to know and understand this sort of crucial part of the history of the people of God. And so, before we jump into Judges, let's kind of set the stage for where these stories take place. Okay? And that's a brief history of Israel according to what we have in the Torah. And so, we see that after starting with kind of the big picture and narrowing down to one family, Abraham, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says to him, leave your land and your family, and I will give you new land and new family. Okay? And I will make you a blessing to all the nations. Two most important things in the ancient world, land and family. Okay? And in fact, those two concepts pretty much define how the ancient world, and especially Israel, thinks of eternal life. Is your ancestors living on the land that has been given to you, and through your children and their descendants on down. So he says, leave your current land and family. I will take you to a new land and give you that land and new family. And of course, we know that Sarah is old. They're both old and have a baby very, very, very late in life. That baby is Isaac, who is specified as the promised offspring through which God will bring his covenant. And then Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob gets a new name, Israel, and the promise goes through Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. And we all know the story of Joseph and how, if we're honest, Joseph is kind of a twerp. And his brothers decide to get rid of him. And he ends up in Egypt, and through a series of events becomes basically number 2 in command to Pharaoh. And because of severe famine, his entire family ends up in Egypt, living in Egypt, in the choicest part of the land of Egypt, in the Nile Delta along the Mediterranean, in a place called Goshen. And then the text says that there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and he enslaves the Israelites and their descendants. The larger people group has begun to grow up. And God raises up Moses to deliver the Israelites. And we have the 10 plagues and all of that. And then they finally leave Egypt, cross the Reed Sea, and into the wilderness where they go to Mount Sinai. And through another series of events, they end up being forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years to let the generation that left Egypt die off and replaced with a new generation because of disobedience. And then Moses dies, is buried on Mount Nebo, and Joshua takes over, who was basically Moses' aide-de-camp throughout the whole wilderness journey, and he leads the Israelites into the Promised Land. And so then the question we get to in the book of Judges is, after Joshua dies, what next? What next? And one of the things I find kind of interesting is God raises up Moses. He's very careful to select Joshua as the successor to Moses. But when Joshua dies, there's no successor. It seems like kind of a curious omission. Why in the world didn't God pick another successor? We'll deal with that in the coming weeks. So, that leads us to the stories that we have in the book of Judges. And so what I have here on this map is the tribal allotments in the land of Israel that are... so thank you for saying that. These are the, on paper, tribal allotments. Okay? This is what they are told. These are the boundaries of the land you're supposed to get. Now, as we will see as we go through the book of Judges, the question is, do they ever get it? And in one tribe's case, they pick up and leave the land that they've been assigned because they can't seem to get it and move somewhere else. Okay? So this map reflects the land that that tribe, the tribe of Dan, was supposed to have, not the land they actually took. Okay? Who's missing from this list when we consider the 12 sons? The Levites are missing. And there's another curious adjustment. So Joseph doesn't get a tribe, but who gets a tribe? Who gets tribes instead? Yes, Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay? And so in effect, what's happened is, because, and this is kind of fun because it's actually against what the Torah says, Joseph is the firstborn of Jacob's favorite wife, not his firstborn. And yet, Joseph gets a double portion of tribes. Each of his sons gets a tribe. And if I'm not mistaken, Manasseh is the older child. And if you'll notice, Manasseh gets a double portion over Ephraim. The blue on this map, the dark blue is Manasseh. You see there's two pieces to Manasseh, and then Ephraim is the green in the middle. Okay, so we see Joseph getting a double portion, and then we see Manasseh getting a double portion from Joseph. So anyway, that's just a little aside. The question I have is, when we look at the land, did Israel take it or didn't they take it?
They sort of took it.
Okay. Sort of. All right. Did they conquer it or did they settle it?
The Bible says they conquered it.
Okay. So and so this is interesting, and this is actually this in years past, this has been a real debate in scholarship about, did Israel conquer the land or did they settle the land? And I'll explain in a little bit why that question is an important one and why it's one that gets raised. But the reality is, if you carefully read the text of them entering the promised land in the book of Joshua, it says both. It says they did both. But that doesn't, there are other problems we're going to have to deal with in a minute. But it seems like they did both. There were, in fact, there's a place where I believe it's the Ephraimites come to Joshua and they complain that there aren't enough places for them to live for all their people. And Joshua says, well, I see a bunch of trees. Why don't you cut down some trees and make some places to live? Okay? Settlement. Also, we see texts that say basically, when you move into the land and you live in the houses you did not build, remember who gave it to you. Okay, so an idea that they conquered or they moved into places as opposed to just tearing everything down. Okay? So, when we look at the book of Judges, one of the things we see is that the book gives us no claim of authorship, nor does it give us any date of authorship, which is pretty common. Okay, most of the books don't give us that information. The book itself is written in third person, so it's written as if it's a third person narrator. That narrator seems to be omniscient, meaning they know a lot of things that an individual by themselves would not know. It also has the perspective of distance from the events. Okay? It's not written in the context of the events as they are happening. It's written after the fact. Okay? It also claims to know, in many ways, Yahweh's perspective, what Yahweh is thinking, what Yahweh says, what Yahweh intends to do. It also offers commentary on Israel's actions and whether it thinks what they did was good or bad. And it has literary and thematic connections to Deuteronomy, to Joshua, and to Samuel through Kings. Okay? It seems to, there are numerous connections between the first 8 chapters of Samuel and Judges, the end of Judges. As we'll see next week, the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges connect together pretty well. Deuteronomy connects well through it. There's not a lot of mention in the book about following the 10 Commandments, other than idolatry. Idolatry is the big thing. It doesn't spend a lot of time talking about some of the other stuff, but it has connections to these other books. And, as we'll see as we go through, most of the stories are stories about what would later be the northern kingdom. Okay? The kingdom of Israel. So we'll look at a minute as to where a lot of these stories take place. So when we talk about the book of Judges, a common way to look at it is what we call the Judges cycle. And so this is actually from Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 11. It says, "Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning, because those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways." Okay, first of all, do you see the perspective distance? This is written in the time after the fact, looking at the totality of these stories. Okay, it's not commentary in the middle. It's looking at it from a distance. Let's see. Secondly, it offers a lot of commentary. Okay, about how they acted, what God thought about how they acted, how the people related to their ancestors. There's a lot in this one passage that talks about that if we look carefully, shows that distance from the events that are taking place in the book. But this Judges cycle, and it's a little easier to read up there, kind of starts with the people turn to idolatry. Okay, then God delivers them over to their enemies. People suffer and cry out to God. God raises a judge. The enemy is defeated by the judge. The people in the land enjoy peace. Then the judge dies, and the whole cycle sort of starts all over again. Okay, and I couldn't easily put it on this chart, but it's not just that the cycle repeats. Imagine it like a boulder rolling down a hill. Okay, every single cycle gets worse than the one before. Okay, it's just a spiral, a downward spiral, a death spiral. So my question is, when we tend to look at these stories, what is the focus? What do we focus on when we read these stories and we talk about this cycle? judge, or we focus on the enemies defeated, okay? All right? Anybody else?
We tend to start with the people suffering.
The people suffering, okay, yeah. They do wrong, they do bad, then they suffer, right? Okay, and they cry out, okay. And in fact, it's interesting, if you go to any commentary on Judges, almost all of them will label these cycles by the name of the enemy. There's the Ammonite cycle, there's the Philistine cycle, there's this cycle, you know, they tend to be named by the enemy that's defeated, okay? Because, for example, the Philistine cycle starts with Samson, but doesn't end with Samson, okay? It takes a little longer for the Philistine cycle to get sorted out, okay? Which is part of the problem with Samson. But I would argue also that the real focus, or a focus that I think is important to look at these books, these stories through, is God. How is God acting? In spite of all these things that are happening, what is God doing?
Forgiving, helping. He's forgiving, he's bringing somebody to help them through their cycles, through their problems, and hoping that people will turn back to him. But unfortunately, people don't do what God wants them to do.
Yes, but yet the cycle continues because
God is ever present. God is ever loving.
and one of the things we'll see, and especially some of the later stories, is some of the things that God does are quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. And so when we get to some of the later stories, we will encounter some what I would call problems in the text that perhaps we don't tell our kids about. And what I think those problems show us, one way to look at them, is that it gives us a much better picture of the qualities and characteristics of God and God's relationship to God's people. Yes, sir.
I think one thing in that regard that's really important is, as a pretext, to remember that God had instructed them that when they went into these lands, and I think he named 6 or 7 specifically, the Canaanites, the Hittites,
Parasites, the Jebusites, the Ites.
Yeah.
Yep.
He made it very clear that he wanted the people that they conquered utterly destroyed. Make no treaties, have no mercy. I mean, it literally says have no mercy. And that would be their downfall.
Yeah, so there's part of that, there is that. There are some other places we may look at where there may be a different interpretation than that. I 100% agree with you that that's in the text. But there are some other places in the text that say something a little bit different. And so we might want to consider how that works. For example, it even says at one point, I did not drive them out from the land because I knew that it would make the land empty and you couldn't populate it. Okay, so it gives sort of an alternate perspective on why they were still in the land. Anyway, we'll come to that. That's actually that's a good observation. Is they were told to do one thing, they didn't do it or couldn't do it, and it leads to challenges. So, here's a question: what is a judge? We throw the term around. What is it?
Military leader.
Oh, that's interesting. A military leader. Okay.
Ruler.
Oh, a ruler? Interesting. Okay. Is that how we use the term judge?
No.
What do we use the term judge to mean?
Justice.
Make decisions.
Someone who settled disputes, who makes justice. Okay. Kind of what's their role and function? We've got a military leader, ruler, justice. Okay. Which raises a big, important question. Is there a difference between a judge and a king? judge is closer?
The judge was closer to a prophet or Aaron's side or that kind of thing more than he was than the king. They had many more religious times in many cases.
Can you give an example?
Not Deborah. It was, I can't remember the names. Sorry.
Okay. Deborah is called a prophetess, I
She is
believe,
called a
and a
prophetess.
judge.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
I won't, there's one in particular that comes to mind that I won't answer until I ask the next question. But there's a question. Is there a judge and a king?
So their ultimate king was God. At least that's the way God wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
Because later when he does raise up Saul, it's because the Israel's groaning, we want a king, we want to be like everybody else. But the judges were in place before that, and God was their king.
Okay. Yeah, so that is the interpretation we get in 1 Samuel. And I'm not disagreeing with that. But when you look at what the day-to-day things that a judge does versus a king, there's not a ton of difference in what they do, except for one thing.
The king was a dynasty. Some of the judges tried to be dynasty.
Okay, dynastic succession.
I mean, you look at Gideon, you know, his sons were not good. Samuel's sons weren't. So some of the judges tried.
Yeah, and in fact, there is clear. We'll spend a week looking at what's the difference between a minor judge and a major judge, because we have kind of two in the book. Especially when you look at the minor judges, although we don't have a lot of detail, what we do have, a lot of it indicates that these guys were kind of like little mini kings. In a lot of the way, they were trying to be at least. Now it doesn't tend to go beyond. It still doesn't take, right? But there seems to be this sort of natural push towards dynastic or building a dynasty. Okay. Who's the last judge? Samuel is the last judge, and I'm going to put an asterisk by that, only because I could probably, no one in scholarship would agree with me, but I could make a good argument that Saul is the last judge in a lot of ways. If you look at what Saul is doing and how he functions and how he acts, he's just not much different than a judge. And he doesn't get dynastic succession either.
The Lord God Almighty is the last judge.
Well, okay, that's a totally different kind of judge. Totally different kind of judge. Now, that's a good segue. That's a good segue into figuring out what it is that this judge really is, okay? The Hebrew name of the book is Shoftim, which is a, I get real nerdy, it's a masculine plural participle. But it means literally, it comes from the verb shaphat. Okay? The verb, most Hebrew nouns come from verbs. Okay? Shaphat is the verb. And what's interesting is I was kind of re-looking at this and went to the kind of the definitive biblical Hebrew dictionary is called Halot, H-A-L-O-T. And it's mine 2 volumes, 2 big volumes. And it has pages. It has a lot on this verb. And one of the things is most think it's a Canaanite loanword. Okay? Now, Canaanite and Hebrew, all those languages are so close together that sometimes it can be very hard to tell them apart. So there's a lot of language that goes between them. But we see it as a Canaanite loanword. And the verb describes an action that brings about or restores shalom. Okay, we've talked about shalom, right? Shalom we translate peace, but it's really more about restoring things to where they're working for the community as the way God intended it. Everything working as it should. Everything being as it should. Okay? That includes the absence of violence and quietness, what we think of as peace, but it includes a whole lot more than that. Justice. Okay? Everybody sort of prospering and living as God intended them to. And so it's more than simply someone who is a judge who administers rulings, or someone who rules, okay, as a king. It's a person who restores the shalom to the community, and it implies that it's a long-term action. So if we go back to that cycle, okay, what we see happening is the people begin to worship idols, which breaks shalom. God raises up an enemy that enslaves them or oppresses them. The people cry out because they're not in shalom. God raises up a judge. That judge defeats the enemy. Okay? And then, with every single judge, it says, with every single major judge, it says, and the land had shalom for X years. And oftentimes that X years is 40, which defines a generation. Now, there are some key places, as we'll see in the book, where all of a sudden that number is not 40 or a multiple of 40, it's 20 or 7 or 6, which indicates that the cycle is increasing and the effectiveness of the restoration of shalom is less effective. Okay? But I'd like you to think about the judges as the individual that God raises up to restore the shalom of the community. And that involves military action, it involves judging, okay? It involves ruling, and it involves getting rid of the thing in society, particularly idolatry, that is breaking the shalom. Okay? Another way to look at it is it's probably better understood as a chieftain. And there's good reason why that might be the case. If we look at Joshua versus Judges, and I have to start this analysis by saying, first of all, that when we look at archaeology cannot prove the Bible's claims. Anybody that tells you that archaeology proves the Bible is misusing archaeology. Plain and simple. And why is that? It's because archaeology is dealing with things we find in the ground. It is science-based. What the Bible is making are theological claims. Okay? Theological claims cannot be proven by archaeology. So, what can it tell us though? Well, one of the things we see is that when we look at the book of Joshua, okay, and all of its conquests, it is very hard to go to the archaeological record and try to look at the claims that the book of Joshua makes around they destroyed this city, they destroyed that city, they did all these things. It is very difficult to find evidence of those claims in the archaeological record. Okay? For example, and I've got a blog post I wrote about this years ago, Jericho. Jericho doesn't fit. The archaeological record of Jericho does not fit the story that we have in Joshua. The way we read the story in Joshua. Okay? And I offer a different way to read the story in Joshua of Jericho that perhaps fits better with what we see in the archaeological setup. The one that gets closest to fitting, actually, is the destruction that we see at Hatzor, which we never talk about. Hatzor was destroyed by fire. The book of Joshua says that they destroyed Hatzor by fire. You can see the cracked stones today. You can see the fire, the burn layer. That generally fits with the timing of Joshua. Now, that archaeological evidence does not prove that Joshua is the one that did it, because there's no inscription that says Joshua came here and burned our city. Okay? We don't have that. All we know is that the book of Joshua says it was burned. We burned it, and we see in the archaeological record that the city was burned. But there's no necessary connection that the two things are the same thing. Does that make sense? That's why we say archaeology can't prove the Bible. Okay? The Bible's making one claim. All we can do is look at the archaeology and say, does it reflect what we see in the ground? And what's interesting is when we get to the book of Judges, there is ample archaeological evidence that supports the social world described in Judges. Okay? Now, there is no archaeological evidence that supports the historicity of the stories in Judges, okay? Nor should we expect there to be any. That's not how archaeology works. But what we can say is that when we look at the stories in the book of Judges, they talk about a period of time, and they talk about a social world of how people are organized that seems to fit what we find in the archaeological record. Does that make sense? We have no proof that there was a Deborah in the archaeology. We have no proof that there was a Gideon or a Jephthah or a Samson in the archaeology. But what it describes is a world in which these same stories seem to populate. Does that make sense? Okay, I know it's a fine line between the two, but that's another reason why I like Judges, is it seems to be describing a world we can kind of get our hands on when we actually go and look at the land. So, what is that social world? Well, it's a social system that is governed by tribal elders and chieftains. Tribes are sort of the top people group. It is confined primarily to what we call the highlands of Israel, the Judean mountains that run north to south in the middle of the country. There are no large cities involved really in it. There is no centralized government. None. And what we see is that these tribes function in some sort of loose confederation in times of need or trouble. And at times, we see in the book of Judges where a particular tribe gets left out, and they get ticked. Why'd you leave us out? Why weren't we called? Okay? So you see that you don't see this, that they are not acting necessarily as a unified nation like we see by the time we get this really to David and then really Solomon. They're much more like a loose confederation of tribes. And it's set in a time when empires were weak. Now, why do I say that? Real quickly. I may have mentioned this before in class, but and I get this idea from a guy named Jim Monson. Dr. Monson taught at Jerusalem University College, where I went for quite a while. And he talks about cats and mice. The cats are the empires, okay? And what I have on this map are sort of the big empires that we see across the biblical text. Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians. Persians would be further off to the east at a later time. But at the time of the book of Judges, the two big ones would be the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire. And so those are what Monson calls cats. And what we have in the hill country, and if you see where Jerusalem is, You can kind of see the Red Sea's at the bottom there, and then the yellow kind of obscures all the land of Israel. But between Jerusalem and Damascus, if you just consider that sort of area, what we have in that general area are Hittites. The Hittites have moved down to the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, all these ites. Okay? And Monson calls all the ites mice. And what happens is that when the cats are away, the mice will play. In other words, when the empires get weakened, okay, they pull back out of this land of Israel, this sort of natural land bridge. They pull out, and when they pull away, what's left is all of these ites that try to fight for dominance. Okay? And so you see the Israelites, again, ites, another mouse, fighting amongst these other peoples. The Philistines, the Eanes also are considered, the Philistines are kind of a mouse. The Arameans are a little bigger. They're more like a rat, maybe a guinea pig. They're bigger than a mouse, but we see the Arameans influencing this whole area. And so what we see in the book of Judges is there's really no mention of the Egyptians, or you get some mention of Hittites, but everybody else is mentioned are these ites, the mice. And so it's this period of time, and we, when one of the things that happens when the Exodus happens is, the plagues have utterly destroyed Egypt, completely weakened Egypt, militarily and economically. So it sets up the time where Egypt would have pulled back from the land. Okay, we see other times, by the time of Samson, or by the time of Solomon, where Egypt is a little stronger, and we see even later in the divided kingdom where Egypt's really strong and exerting influence, okay, over the area. But in this period of time, these empires are pulled away, and all the ites are fighting each other. Okay, so the stories in the book of Judges are worth revisiting as adults because they are not children's stories. And they have some important themes that will tell us things about what we can learn about God and what we can learn about God's people and their relationship that I think is even important for us today. And so for next week, what I'd like you to look at is, we're going to look at how the book introduces itself. And I'd like you to read Joshua 24, the last chapter of Joshua, and also read Judges 1 through chapter 2, verse 10. And I'd like you to look for what I will call contradictions and repetitions. One example is, how many times does Joshua die? And then, did Israel take the land or not? And if so, how did they take it? And see if you see different answers to some of these questions as you read these different texts. And we'll discuss that, and then the following week we'll jump into the first of the Judges. All right, thank you all very much, and we'll see you next week.